The bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead as an elderly woman stepped up to the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her purse. She had lived through countless decades, seen things most could only dream of, yet there was something about this moment that made her feel vulnerable. Behind the cash register, the young cashier smirked, clearly unimpressed by her slow, deliberate movements. His mocking tone echoed across the store as he made a cruel remark about her age. But what he didn't know was that this elderly woman wasn't just any senior. Her true identity would leave him speechless and change his life forever. It was a typical Thursday morning in a bustling suburban grocery store. The shelves were neatly stacked with colorful boxes of cereal, canned goods, and fresh vegetables, offering a snapshot of daily life for the people who came in and out. It was a place where strangers exchanged pleasantries over the hum of the checkout lines, where small talk was as regular as the beep of the barcode scanner. Marlene Harper, the elderly woman at the heart of our story, shuffled down the aisles, her cane tapping lightly against the cold tile floor. Her white hair was neatly pinned back, and her navy blue cardigan hung loosely around her frail shoulders. Her age, 75 years, was evident in the deep lines etched into her face, but it was the spark in her eyes that hinted at a life lived fully, a life filled with resilience and strength. She moved with deliberate care, not because of weakness, but because she valued every step she took. Marlene had seen a lot in her lifetime. She had grown up in a small town, raised children of her own, and even survived the loss of a beloved husband years ago. She had faced hardships, but never allowed them to define her. Now in her golden years, Marlene enjoyed the simpler pleasures, like a quiet walk in the park or a cup of hot tea in the late afternoon. But today was different. Today she was on her way to the local grocery store to pick up a few essentials. Nothing extraordinary, just another day, or so she thought. Behind the counter, young Adam Sullivan, a 22-year-old cashier, was finishing up scanning a few items for the person ahead of Marlene. Adam was a picture of youth and arrogance, his messy hair falling into his eyes, his uniform slightly askew, and a smirk that never seemed to leave his face. He had worked at this store for several months now, and while he didn't exactly love his job, it was a way to pay the bills while he figured out his next move in life. His patience for the elderly wasn't particularly high, and he often found himself annoyed by their slow movements and long-winded stories. In his mind, they were a part of the past. People who had already lived their lives and didn't really fit into the fast-paced world of today. As Marlene approached the counter, Adam's eyes flicked up from the register. He saw her, an elderly woman with trembling hands, clutching her purse a little too tightly as she stepped forward. A small, condescending smile played on his lips. "Well, aren't we in a hurry?" he remarked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Don't worry, I've got all day to wait for you, Grandma." Marlene paused, the sting of his words surprising her, but she didn't flinch. She had faced much worse in her life. Instead, she smiled softly, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not in a hurry, dear, just taking my time, as we should all do." But Adam was already rolling his eyes, his impatience growing. As he began to scan her items, he muttered under his breath, "This is why old people shouldn't be allowed to shop alone. They're so slow." Marlene, however, was no ordinary elderly woman, and what Adam didn't know yet was that this interaction would unfold in a way that neither of them could have expected. What Adam thought was a simple, unremarkable encounter was about to reveal something much deeper. Something that would change both of their lives forever. The air around Marlene and Adam was thick with tension. As Adam swiped the items through the register, the words he had carelessly thrown out earlier echoed in Marlene's mind. The sarcastic tone, the dismissive attitude, it wasn't new, but something about this encounter felt different. She had faced mockery before, but she never let it define her. Today, however, she felt a strange unease, as though something was amiss in the very fabric of this encounter. Adam, on the other hand, was already growing more frustrated. He glanced at the clock on the wall. This elderly woman was taking far too long, he thought. She seemed lost in thought as she carefully counted out the change, her fingers trembling slightly. The rest of the line behind her was starting to grow impatient. One by one, customers shot her annoyed glances. Adam shifted his weight from one foot to the other, tapping his fingers against the counter in an exaggerated rhythm. He wanted to hurry her along, to get the transaction over with, and move on to something more interesting than whatever story she was sure to share. "Are you sure that's all?" Adam asked, his voice strained, but laced with impatience. "We're not running a charity here." Marlene looked up at him, her eyes sharp now. For the first time, she noticed something about Adam, something that made her pause. His smugness, his arrogance, his disregard for those who had lived longer than he had, all hinted at an underlying insecurity. Adam wasn't the confident, cocky young man he tried to project. It wasn't just a matter of rudeness or carelessness. There was something deeper behind his words, something that perhaps even he hadn't realized about himself yet. "No, dear," Marlene said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "We're not running a charity, but kindness. Kindness is something that costs nothing." Adam blinked, taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected that response. It wasn't the usual old lady reaction he was accustomed to. The words hit him in an unexpected way, though he couldn't quite understand why. He cleared his throat and quickly finished the transaction, the coins clinking as they dropped into the register. He was almost eager for the encounter to end, but as Marlene gathered her change, she lingered, a quiet presence beside him. Something in her eyes made Adam uneasy, but he couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way she seemed so calm, so unruffled by his earlier jabs. Or maybe it was the fact that she wasn't angry at him. She wasn't demanding an apology. She wasn't even disappointed. It made him uncomfortable, and that discomfort made him want to push her further. He wanted her to snap. He wanted to see her lose her composure, to prove that he was in control. "You know," he began, trying to mask his insecurity with forced bravado, "you probably don't remember, but I saw you around here a few months ago. You're one of those people who can't stop talking about the good old days. Huh. You know, when everything was better or whatever." Marlene paused for a moment. She had heard the term good old days thrown around by younger generations so often, as if they were a relic of some far-off mythical time. People, especially young people, often looked at the past through rose-tinted glasses, forgetting that every era had its struggles. "No, dear," she replied, her voice steady, but with a touch of warmth. "I don't speak of the good old days to relive the past, but to remind myself of what truly matters. The present is fleeting, and we must value it before it's gone." Adam chuckled dismissively, though his smirk faltered as the words lingered in his mind. He didn't understand them fully, but they felt like a challenge, a reminder that the world wasn't as simple as he liked to think. As he handed her the receipt, his tone turned sharp again. "Well, here's your change. Have a nice day, Grandma." Marlene took the receipt, her fingers lightly brushing his hand as she did. A brief flash of recognition crossed her face, a feeling that Adam couldn't understand. But Marlene didn't speak of it. She simply nodded, her smile softening. She left the counter and slowly made her way toward the exit. Adam watched her go, a nagging sense of confusion building inside him. Why did that conversation bother him so much? He had been rude to plenty of people before, but none of them had left him feeling like this. None of them had made him question his own attitude so profoundly. As Marlene left the store, she passed a group of teenagers hanging out near the entrance. They stared at her, but she paid them no mind. The outside world had grown unfamiliar to her over the years. It was strange to think that she had once been their age, once walked the streets with the same energy and confidence they had. But time had a way of changing things, of softening the hard edges of youth. She didn't feel bitter about the years she had lived. She felt grateful. Yet as she walked to her car, Marlene's thoughts drifted back to Adam. Something told her that this encounter wasn't over. She had learned a long time ago that life had a funny way of bringing unresolved things back around. Meanwhile, Adam continued his shift, his mind racing. His interactions with Marlene had left him with a strange, unsettled feeling, one he couldn't shake. As he rang up the next customer, a middle-aged man, his thoughts wandered back to the elderly woman and her words. He couldn't quite understand why she'd been so composed in the face of his rudeness, why she hadn't reacted the way he expected. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice his manager, Sarah, walking up behind him. "Hey, Adam," she said, her voice sharp. "Can you keep it together today? You've been off." Adam straightened up, trying to shake off his unease. Yeah, I'm fine." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "You didn't seem fine earlier. That old woman you just checked out. She's been in here before. I've heard stories about her." Adam frowned. "What stories?" "Some of the regulars say she's connected to some pretty important people," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "Not just anyone. I mean, she's got history. You'd be wise to show her more respect next time." Adam's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Sarah sighed and walked away, leaving Adam to digest her words. Marlene, the elderly woman he had mocked and belittled, was connected to something bigger? It didn't make sense. But the more he thought about it, the more his curiosity grew. What was her real story? Later that evening, as Adam sat at home, scrolling through social media to pass the time, he stumbled across a news article. The headline caught his attention. Philanthropist and humanitarian Marlene Harper donates millions to charity, continues to support communities worldwide. He blinked, confused. The name was too familiar to ignore. Could it really be the same Marlene Harper? He clicked on the link, and as the story loaded, his jaw dropped. The article described Marlene as a philanthropist with vast wealth and influence, someone who had spent decades supporting causes across the globe. Her quiet demeanor wasn't a sign of fragility. It was a reflection of her humility. It hit him then. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had belittled, was someone he should have revered, not dismissed. He felt a wave of shame wash over him as he realized how wrong he had been. What had he done? How could he have treated her that way? The article went on to describe her charitable endeavors and her role as a mentor to young leaders, someone who had shaped the lives of many influential figures around the world. His mind raced. Marlene wasn't just some old lady with nothing left to contribute. She was a force, a person whose actions had touched lives in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. Adam sat back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of regret. The reality of what he had done to Marlene and the realization of who she truly was hit him hard. But now it was too late to change what had happened. All he could do was reflect on his actions and hope for a chance to make things right. Marlene, on the other hand, didn't know that Adam had seen the article. She had moved on, as she always did. But she knew that life had a way of teaching lessons, and sometimes those lessons came when you least expected them. The next time she visited the store, Adam was behind the counter again. This time, when their eyes met, he didn't smirk. He didn't mock her. Instead, he stood up straighter, a silent apology in his posture. And for the first time in their interaction, Marlene smiled. Not the soft smile from before, but one that conveyed understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. The lesson had been learned, and Adam would never forget it. The following days felt like a blur to Adam. He went through the motions of work, his mind continually circling back to Marlene and the discovery about her that had shattered his perception. Every time he saw an elderly person, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. He had never realized how much his words, how much his behavior could impact someone. Yet the guilt kept gnawing at him, and he found it difficult to shake off the profound regret that had settled into his chest. As the days passed, Adam tried to act normal, but his interactions with others felt empty, shallow. His coworkers noticed it, but none said anything. He began to pay more attention to the elderly customers who came in, watching them with a sense of empathy he hadn't known he was capable of. It was as though Marlene's presence had awakened something in him, a sensitivity he had never nurtured, a capacity for kindness he had buried deep beneath layers of youthful arrogance. One late afternoon, Adam's shift was nearing its end when, to his surprise, Marlene walked into the store again. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular. She walked slowly through the aisles, her eyes scanning the shelves as though she had all the time in the world. Adam's heart raced as he saw her from across the store. The sight of her reminded him of the interaction they had, the harsh words, the mocking tone. He knew he owed her an apology, but how could he possibly make it right? How could he undo the hurt he had caused? He wrestled with his emotions, trying to find the courage to approach her, but every time he gathered his thoughts, the words felt inadequate. Could he even make up for the cruelty he had shown? His thoughts were interrupted when Marlene turned and began heading toward his register. She came closer, her footsteps steady and unhurried. Adam felt a lump form in his throat. He had never felt so small in his life. She reached the counter, and as her eyes met his, the familiar calmness was there. But there was something different in her gaze this time. Something deeper. "Good evening, Adam," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound sad, but there was an unmistakable gravity in her tone. "Good evening, Ms. Harper," Adam replied, his voice quieter than he intended. Marlene set a few items on the counter, but her eyes never left his. There was a long, pregnant silence that stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Adam's heart pounded in his chest, his palms growing sweaty. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. His mind scrambled for something, anything that might sound right, but nothing came. Marlene's gaze softened, but her voice was firm when she spoke again. "I saw the article you read about me," she said, her words measured but not unkind. "I understand that it might have been a shock, but I want you to know, Adam, that what I do with my life, my work, my fortune, none of it means anything if I don't teach people the value of compassion. I would rather give away everything I have if it means helping others learn to treat people with kindness." Adam swallowed hard, his throat dry. I, I'm so sorry," he managed, his voice thick. I, I didn't know who you were. I had no right to treat you the way I did. I was rude and Adam," she interrupted, her tone gentle but direct. "I'm not here to make you feel worse, but I am here to remind you that your words have power. People like you, young people with so much ahead of them, have the ability to change the world, but not with your sarcasm, not with your judgment. You change it with your heart." The weight of her words struck him like a punch to the gut. For the first time, he felt the sting of his own behavior in a way he had never before. He had always prided himself on being honest or straightforward, never realizing that there was a deeper, more meaningful way to communicate with others. I, I don't know what to say," Adam stammered, his mind racing. The apology felt so inadequate for what he had done. Marlene studied him for a moment, and then, with a deep sigh, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, unassuming envelope. She placed it on the counter in front of him. Adam glanced at it, confused. "This is for you," she said. "Open it when you're ready." Adam stared at the envelope for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. What was this? What could possibly be inside? He was still trying to process the gravity of their conversation, still reeling from her words, but curiosity gnawed at him. What could a woman like Marlene want from someone like him? "I don't want anything," she continued, sensing his hesitation. "This isn't a bribe. It's just something I believe you should have." Adam's hand shook slightly as he picked up the envelope. There was no name on it, no address. It was simple, plain, just an ordinary envelope, yet it felt weighty in his grasp. He tore it open slowly, the sound of the paper crinkling filling the silence. Inside there was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. He unfolded it, and what he saw left him speechless. It was a check, a large one, a check for a sum of money that Adam couldn't even begin to comprehend. His eyes widened as he read the words written in elegant script, "To Adam Sullivan. May this gift remind you that kindness can open doors beyond your imagination. Use it for your future, for your dreams." Adam's mind spun as he tried to process the meaning of what was before him. This wasn't just any check. It was a check for a sum large enough to change his life, his career, his ambitions, his future. But what did she mean by this? Why him? Why now? He looked up at her, his mouth dry. I don't understand." Marlene smiled, but there was no condescension in it, no mockery. "It's not about the money, Adam. It's about the potential you have inside of you. You've been given a gift, a chance. What you choose to do with it is entirely up to you. But don't let your anger, your impatience, cloud your vision. Don't waste the opportunities that will come your way." Adam's world tilted on its axis as he stared at the check. Was this a joke? Was she playing with him? He looked back at Marlene, but her face was calm. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite identify. Hope, perhaps. She wasn't angry. She wasn't mocking him. She was offering him a chance, an opportunity. His pulse quickened. What did he do? What could he possibly do with something like this? Was he even worthy of it? Marlene, I don't deserve this, he whispered, shaking his head. No, she said softly. You don't deserve it. Not yet, but you will. You just need to open your heart. The words hit him like a tidal wave, washing over him in a flood of realization. He had been so focused on the wrong things, his impatience, his pride, his cynicism, and in doing so, he had missed the true meaning of success, the true meaning of living a life with purpose. In that moment, Adam understood. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about being right or superior. It was about learning to be humble, learning to see the potential in others, and most importantly, learning to see the potential in himself. Marlene's eyes held his for a long, searching moment, and then she turned to leave. As she walked toward the door, Adam stood there frozen in place, the weight of the envelope still in his hands. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. And then, just as she was about to exit, Marlene paused and glanced over her shoulder. Adam, she called, her voice calm yet firm. Remember one thing. Kindness is not a gift. It is a choice. With that, she disappeared through the door, leaving Adam standing at the counter, the check in his hand and the world at his feet. The next day, Adam walked into the store a changed man. As the days passed after that pivotal moment with Marlene, Adam felt something inside him shifting. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and suddenly everything felt different. The world around him no longer seemed like a series of monotonous routines, but rather an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to make amends. His actions, words, and even his thoughts were changing, becoming more deliberate, more thoughtful. It was no longer enough to simply go through the motions. Now he felt compelled to be intentional in every decision, every interaction. It wasn't easy at first. Adam had spent years building walls around himself, walls made of pride, arrogance, and skepticism. These walls didn't come down overnight, but with each passing day, he chipped away at them, piece by piece. His colleagues noticed the change almost immediately. Adam, the young man who used to brush off feedback with a smirk or a joke, was now listening, really listening when people spoke. He wasn't perfect, of course, and there were moments when old habits tried to resurface, but Adam was learning to catch himself before he fell back into those patterns. It was the small moments, the tiny acts of kindness, that made the biggest difference. He started taking the time to genuinely ask his customers how their day was going, making sure to offer a smile and a kind word to everyone who walked into the store. The elderly customers especially began to gravitate toward him. He found himself going out of his way to help them, whether it was carrying their bags to their car or simply listening to their stories about the past. Adam had always felt like he was in a rush, always too busy for others, but now it was as if he was seeing them for the first time. But it wasn't just the elderly customers who benefited from this newfound kindness. Adam began to rebuild relationships with his coworkers too. He started offering his help more often, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to make the work environment better for everyone. He even apologized to several of his coworkers for his past behavior, something he would never have done before. Punini, it was humbling, and at times, uncomfortable. But Adam soon realized that apologizing didn't make him weak. It made him stronger. It was a sign of growth, of maturity. And slowly but surely, his relationships at work began to improve. The check from Marlene, however, remained a mystery. He had placed it in his drawer, unsure of what to do with it. His first instinct was to refuse it, to give it back. He didn't deserve it, not after everything he had done. But as time went on, Adam realized that Marlene had given him something far more valuable than just money. She had given him a chance to prove to himself that he could be better, that he could change, and that he could make a real difference in the world. He decided to use the money for something meaningful. He enrolled in a professional development course, one that focused on leadership and communication skills. It was something he had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. Now with Marlene's gift, he had the opportunity to invest in his future, not out of a desire for recognition, but out of a desire to become someone who could make a positive impact on the world. A few months later, Adam's life looked very different from the young man who had first mocked Marlene in the store. He had completed the course, gaining valuable skills that he was now putting into practice. He had been promoted to a supervisory position, a role he once thought he was too young or inexperienced for. But it wasn't the promotion that mattered most to him. What mattered was the way he had earned it, through hard work, humility, and kindness. He had earned the respect of his peers not by being the smartest or the fastest, but by showing up every day with a willingness to listen, learn, and grow. One afternoon, as Adam was walking through the aisles of the store, he saw a familiar figure, Marlene. She had returned, though it had been several months since their last encounter. This time, Adam didn't feel the nervousness or guilt that had consumed him before. Instead, he felt a sense of peace, of gratitude. He approached her with a warm smile. "Ms. Harper?" He greeted her, his voice genuine. "It's so good to see you again." Marlene turned to face him, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Adam," she said with a smile, "I'm glad to see you're doing well." Adam felt a warmth in his chest at her words. It was clear that she had noticed the change in him, and her approval meant more to him than he could put into words. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for everything, for your gift, for your words. They've made all the difference." Marlene nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You made the difference, Adam. You chose to change. That's something you should be proud of." Adam's heart swelled. He had always thought that he needed to change for someone else, that he needed to prove something to others. But now he realized that the change had always been about himself. He had the power to shape his own future, and he had finally chosen to do so with kindness, compassion, and humility. "I'm not perfect," Adam continued, his voice filled with honesty, "but I'm trying every day to be better, to do better, and I owe a lot of that to you." Marlene smiled, a hint of pride in her eyes. "I knew you had it in you, Adam. Keep going. Keep growing." As they stood there talking for a few more moments, Adam realized that the story wasn't just about him and Marlene. It was about everyone. The impact we have on one another, the choices we make, and how those choices ripple through the lives of others. The kindness we offer doesn't always come in grand gestures or large sums of money. Sometimes it's just a smile, a word of encouragement, or a moment of understanding. Those small acts can change the course of someone's day, and over time, they can change the course of someone's life. When Marlene left the store that day, Adam stood at the counter, his heart full. He looked down at the check she had given him, now framed and hanging on the wall of his office. It wasn't just a symbol of her generosity, it was a symbol of his transformation, of his growth, and of the person he had become. And though he had come a long way, Adam knew there was still more to learn, more to experience, and more to give. As the weeks turned into months, Adam's life continued to unfold in ways he had never imagined. He was promoted again, this time to a management position, where he was responsible for overseeing a team. He used his platform to encourage others, to mentor those who were struggling, and to foster a work environment where kindness was the foundation. His relationships with his co-workers and customers flourished, and he found himself making a genuine difference in their lives. But the most significant change came within him. Adam had learned to see beyond himself, to recognize the value in others, and to treat every person with the respect and dignity they deserved. The lessons Marlene had taught him were not ones he would ever forget. One evening, as Adam was reflecting on his journey, he realized something profound. He wasn't just a product of his circumstances. He was a product of his choices, and every choice, no matter how small, had the power to shape his future. He thought back to the young man he used to be, the one who had mocked Marlene, the one who had been consumed by pride and arrogance. That person felt like a distant memory, someone he had long since outgrown. And as he looked ahead, Adam knew that his journey wasn't over. There was still so much more to do, so much more to learn, and so much more kindness to give. The story of Adam and Marlene was one of transformation, but it was also a story of hope. It was a reminder that no matter where we start, no matter how lost we might feel, there is always a chance to change. And that change doesn't just come from outside forces, it comes from within. The power to become better, to be kinder, to be more compassionate lies in each and every one of us. And once we realize that, there's no telling how far we can go. As Adam continued to grow, he made a vow to carry the lessons Marlene had taught him into every part of his life, to be the kind of person who didn't just live for himself, but for others. Because in the end, that's what really mattered. And with that, Adam knew that he had found his true purpose. Not in the promotion, not in the money, but in the simple, powerful act of kindness. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this emotional story, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts about the story. In every school, there are moments that leave a permanent mark on a child's soul. Some scars are invisible, but they hurt the most. Meet Amira, a quiet, hard-working student who has always done her best despite her circumstances. One fateful day, she finds herself humiliated in front of the entire class by a teacher whose words cut deeper than any blade. What happens next shakes the very core of the school. The principal's response to this cruelty is not what anyone expected. How will Amira's life change from this moment? And what is the hidden truth behind the principal's shocking decision? Amira was a girl of remarkable resilience. Growing up in a small, rundown neighborhood, she was no stranger to hardship. Her father, a factory worker, had passed away years ago, and her mother worked tirelessly as a housekeeper to make ends meet. Despite their struggles, Amira was determined to get an education and build a better future. School was her escape, her place of hope, where dreams could be made real. But Amira's dreams were often overshadowed by the harsh realities of her life. She wore the same faded uniform day after day, her shoes barely held together with patches. Many of her classmates would snicker behind her back, whispering about her worn-out clothes and the constant smell of cheap detergent that lingered in her hair. But Amira didn't mind. She had bigger things on her mind than the cruelty of kids who didn't understand. Her favorite subject was English, and she excelled in it despite the odds. She pored over books borrowed from the library, every word she read filling her with a sense of wonder and possibility. Her teacher, Mrs. Lawrence, was known for being strict but fair. At least that's how it seemed at first. Mrs. Lawrence was a woman with sharp eyes, always quick to spot even the smallest mistake. She had a reputation for being tough on her students, but no one could deny that she was a perfectionist when it came to her subject. She believed that discipline and high standards would lead her students to success. But what others didn't know was that she carried a bitterness from her own unfulfilled dreams. She had once dreamed of becoming an author, but ended up settling for a job as a teacher when her writing aspirations faded. On this particular day, the weather outside was grim, with dark clouds hanging heavy in the sky as though reflecting the brewing tension inside the classroom. Amira sat in the third row, clutching her notebook tightly as Mrs. Lawrence paced in front of the blackboard, preparing the class for an impromptu quiz. The students seemed to squirm in their seats, but Amira, as always, remained calm and focused. She had studied for this moment. As Mrs. Lawrence began asking the questions, Amira's hand shot up first each time. Her answers were precise, well thought out, and delivered with quiet confidence. But there was something in Mrs. Lawrence's eyes, something colder, sharper, something that suggested that no matter how hard Amira tried, she would never be good enough in the eyes of this teacher. The quiz went on, and Amira continued to impress her classmates with her knowledge. But as the bell rang and everyone began to pack up, Mrs. Lawrence called her up to the front of the class. Her voice was sharp, almost accusatory. "Amira, you think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Just because you can answer a few questions doesn't mean you're special?" The words came out of nowhere, and Amira's heart sank. She had never done anything to provoke Mrs. Lawrence, but the teacher's eyes were narrowed in judgment. The other students watched in silence as Mrs. Lawrence continued, her words like daggers. "You think just because you've read a few books, you'll somehow rise above your station in life? Well, let me tell you something. Amira, people like you never change." Her voice echoed in the room, and Amira could feel every pair of eyes boring into her. She wanted to cry, to run away, but instead she stood there, frozen, humiliated beyond words. The room was quiet as Mrs. Lawrence turned her back and gave a dismissive wave. "You're dismissed. You're not as special as you think." Amira left the classroom, her face red with shame. What had she done to deserve this? Why had Mrs. Lawrence singled her out? She walked through the hallways in a daze, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. Little did Amira know that this moment would spark a series of events that would change everything. Because the principal of the school, Mr. Henderson, was a man who believed in justice, one who would not let this kind of behavior slide without consequences. And his response to the teacher's actions would shock the entire school, turning the tables in a way no one could have predicted. After the incident in Mrs. Lawrence's class, Amira's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her heart felt heavy as she walked home that day, the weight of the humiliation pressing on her chest. Every step she took seemed to echo the cruel words of her teacher. "You're not as special as you think," Mrs. Lawrence had said, and those words haunted her long after the school bell had rung. Amira didn't tell her mother about what had happened. Her mother was already working long hours and couldn't afford to be burdened with the heavy emotions Amira carried. Besides, she didn't want to add to her mother's worries. Her mother had always told her to keep her head high and not let anything or anyone get in the way of her dreams. But today, Amira's dream of rising above her circumstances seemed distant, shattered by a single moment of cruelty. In the days that followed, Amira's classmates began to treat her differently. Some of them whispered when she passed by, others openly mocked her, calling her the teacher's pet or too good for us. It was clear that Mrs. Lawrence's words had affected more than just Amira. It had created a rift between her and her peers. Amira felt increasingly isolated, her only solace found in her books. She would lock herself away in her room, reading novels that transported her to worlds far away from the harsh reality of her own life. But the pain of what had happened in class was a constant, gnawing presence. She couldn't escape it. One day, after another particularly difficult morning in class, Amira made her way to the school's small library to gather her thoughts. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, noticed her looking downcast as she passed by and offered her a kind smile. "You seem troubled, dear," Mrs. Carter said gently, her voice a soft balm on Amira's frayed nerves. Amira hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It's nothing, Mrs. Carter, just school stuff." Mrs. Carter, who had seen her fair share of students struggling with more than just academic challenges, took a step closer. "Amira, you know you can always talk to me. Sometimes it helps to get things off your chest." Amira looked into the older woman's kind eyes and, for the first time in days, felt a flicker of warmth. Slowly, she opened up about the incident with Mrs. Lawrence, her voice trembling as she recalled the cruel words that had left her feeling so small. Mrs. Carter listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Amira, no one should make you feel like that. Not your teacher, not anyone." She sighed, shaking her head. "Mrs. Lawrence is a tough one, but I know she's not a bad person at heart. Maybe she didn't realize how deeply her words would affect you." Amira's chest tightened. "It doesn't matter. It's like she doesn't see me as a person. To her, I'm just a poor girl who doesn't belong here." Mrs. Carter gave her a sympathetic look. "I understand, but you don't have to let her words define you. You're much more than her opinions, Amira. Don't let her take away what you've worked so hard for." Amira nodded, feeling a small sense of comfort in Mrs. Carter's words. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Could she really rise above this? Could she continue to be the person she wanted to be, despite the harsh judgment of others? The days dragged on, and the tension in the classroom only grew. Mrs. Lawrence, seemingly unaware of the impact her words had had on Amira, continued to favor the more affluent students, praising them for their answers, while offering harsh critiques for Amira's every mistake. Every day felt like a battle, and Amira began to wonder whether it was even worth it to keep trying. Then one morning, things took a turn for the worse. Amira had stayed up late studying for a history test, determined to prove that she could excel no matter the odds. When the test results were handed out, she was shocked to see that her score was lower than she had expected. It wasn't the worst grade in the class, but it was certainly disappointing for someone who had worked so hard. Amira sat quietly at her desk, staring at the paper in disbelief. She had studied so much, had poured her heart into every lesson, and yet it felt like it was never enough. She could hear Mrs. Lawrence's voice in her mind, repeating her earlier words. "People like you never change." The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and the students shuffled out of the room. As Amira gathered her things, Mrs. Lawrence called out to her once more. Amira, I'd like to see you in my office after school. Amira's stomach churned with anxiety. What more could Mrs. Lawrence have to say to her? She had already humiliated her in front of the class. Now she was being summoned to her office. The thought of facing her again was unbearable, but Amira had no choice. After school, she walked slowly to the teacher's office, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. When she arrived, Mrs. Lawrence was sitting at her desk, her stern expression unchanging. Sit down, Amira, she instructed. Amira took a seat, her heart racing in her chest. Mrs. Lawrence looked at her for a long moment before speaking. You didn't do well on the test, she said bluntly, and that's disappointing, but I've been thinking about you, about how you've been acting in class lately. Amira's breath caught in her throat. What could she possibly mean by that? She had been trying her best, hadn't she? Mrs. Lawrence's eyes narrowed. You think you can just coast by on your intelligence, don't you? That's not how the world works. You have to work harder, Amira. You're not as special as you think. Amira's face flushed with shame. I've been trying, Mrs. Lawrence. I've been studying hard. Mrs. Lawrence held up a hand, cutting her off. Studying isn't enough. It's about who you are, who you surround yourself with, how you present yourself to the world. She stood up from her desk and paced in front of Amira, her voice growing sharper. And right now, you're failing to understand that. You're letting your circumstances define you. Amira felt her throat tighten, her eyes welling up with tears. She had never felt so alone, so insignificant. She wanted to scream, to tell Mrs. Lawrence how wrong she was, how she was more than just her circumstances. But the words wouldn't come. Just as Amira thought she might break, the door to the office swung open, and Mr. Henderson, the school principal, walked in. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. He was a tall, imposing figure, known for his no-nonsense approach to discipline, but also for his unwavering sense of fairness. Is there a problem here? Mr. Henderson's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Amira feel a flicker of hope. Mrs. Lawrence turned to him, her face hardening. I'm just trying to get through to Amira. She thinks she's above everyone else, but she doesn't understand the reality of the world she's living in. Mr. Henderson's gaze shifted to Amira, and for the first time in what felt like days, she saw someone who truly saw her. Amira, he said softly, I know this must be difficult for you, but you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've already shown that you're capable of more than anyone expected. Amira blinked, surprised by his words. Turning to Mrs. Lawrence, Mr. Henderson's tone grew more serious. I've received multiple complaints about your treatment of Amira, and frankly, I'm disappointed. This is not how we treat students at this school, and certainly not how we treat someone who's working as hard as she is. Mrs. Lawrence's face reddened. But No, Mr. Henderson interrupted. You've crossed a line, and there will be consequences for that. Amira looked between the two of them, her heart racing. Was this really happening? Mrs. Lawrence's stern demeanor faltered, and she seemed to shrink in front of Amira. You can't be serious. This is just how it works. She needs to learn. Mr. Henderson shook his head. No, Mrs. Lawrence, you need to learn. The only lesson here is that respect, kindness, and fairness matter more than anything else. With that, he turned to Amira. Go home, Amira, and know this. This is not your fault. We will make sure this is handled properly. Amira stood there stunned. For the first time, someone had stood up for her. The weight that had been crushing her chest lifted, and she felt a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Little did she know this moment would change everything. And as the events unfolded, the entire school would be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The day after Mr. Henderson had confronted Mrs. Lawrence, Amira's life felt like it was teetering on the edge of a precipice. She walked into school with a sense of unease that hadn't left her since the confrontation. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to cling to everything and everyone around her. As she made her way to her locker, she overheard whispers, some sympathetic, others mocking. But the weight of the previous day's events hung over her like a storm cloud, unpredictable and looming. Despite the tension, Amira was determined to keep her head high. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You're better than this. Don't let anyone make you feel small." But as the minutes passed and the bell rang for class, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When she entered Mrs. Lawrence's classroom, the teacher was standing by her desk, the same cold, distant look in her eyes. The room grew quiet as Amira took her seat. Mrs. Lawrence, her expression unreadable, began the lesson without acknowledging the tension between them. But it was clear to everyone that something had changed. The usual biting remarks and pointed criticisms had been replaced by an almost icy silence, an unspoken animosity that lingered in the air. For the first time in weeks, Amira was able to focus on her work without the weight of constant judgment bearing down on her. She answered every question with precision, her confidence slowly rebuilding. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her instincts were right. It was during the last class of the day that the tension finally erupted. Amira had just finished a particularly difficult math problem, and as she raised her hand to present her solution, she noticed that Mrs. Lawrence was looking at her with an expression that was colder than ever. When Mrs. Lawrence called on her to answer, there was a flicker of something darker in her eyes. "Amira," Mrs. Lawrence said, her voice sharp, "I think it's time you learned a valuable lesson, not just in mathematics, but in life." The rest of the class went eerily still. Amira's stomach twisted in knots. What was she going to do now? Everyone was watching, waiting for whatever Mrs. Lawrence had planned next. Mrs. Lawrence walked toward Amira, her steps deliberate and calculated. As she stood in front of the desk, she paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "You think that just because you're a good student, you deserve special treatment. You think that you can get by with that sweet little story of yours? But the truth is, Amira, there's a limit to what your books and your grades will do for you in this world." Amira froze. Her breath caught in her throat. What was she talking about? She had never once expected special treatment. All she wanted was to be seen as someone worthy of respect, someone who could make a difference in the world. But Mrs. Lawrence's words weren't just cruel. They were a direct attack on everything she had ever believed in. "You're nothing more than a poor girl who thinks she can escape her reality," Mrs. Lawrence sneered, "and that's why you'll never truly fit in here." The words hit Amira like a slap to the face. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think. But as she looked around the room at the students, some of whom were silently watching, some with expressions of surprise, others with clear amusement, something inside her snapped. Amira stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room went silent as she faced Mrs. Lawrence, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "You're wrong," she said, her voice rising. "I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval. I've worked for everything I have. I've struggled, I've sacrificed, and I will continue to do so. But what I won't do is let you or anyone else make me feel like I don't belong. I am not my circumstances, and I am not your idea of what I should be." There was a beat of silence before Mrs. Lawrence scoffed, her lips curling into a disdainful smile. "You're delusional if you think that little speech will change anything. You'll always be that poor girl who thinks she can be something more than she is." Amira could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the anger rising in her veins. She had spent so long trying to prove herself to others, trying to show that she was worth something beyond her poverty. But now as she stood there facing Mrs. Lawrence, something clicked inside her. She wasn't going to let this teacher, this woman who was supposed to inspire students, tear her down anymore. Not today, not ever again. With a sharp, determined breath, Amira took a step back, glancing at the door. She knew that what she was about to do would change everything. There was no turning back now. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice resolute. "I don't need to be here anymore. I don't need this class, and I certainly don't need you." Before anyone could say anything, Amira turned on her heel and strode toward the door. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the classroom, and for a brief moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. As she reached the door, she heard Mrs. Lawrence's voice, louder, more forceful now, call after her. "You can't just walk away from this, Amira. You'll regret this." But Amira didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She didn't let the fear, the doubt, or the shame pull her back. This was her moment, and she was taking it. When she stepped out into the hallway, she felt a strange sense of freedom, relief even, as though a weight she didn't realize she was carrying had been lifted off her shoulders. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt truly in control of her own destiny. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and Amira's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way to the school courtyard. Her classmates were gathered in groups, talking and laughing, but there was no joy for Amira. She knew that her actions had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. Her words had been heard, and there was no telling what would come of them. Just as she was about to leave the school grounds, she heard someone call her name. Amira! She turned to see Mr. Henderson standing at the gates of the school, his expression stern, but his eyes filled with something else, something softer, more understanding. Can I talk to you for a moment? He asked, his voice gentle. Amira hesitated. She had expected him to reprimand her for her outburst, but the calmness in his demeanor gave her pause. I know you're upset, he said, stepping closer, and I know what happened in Mrs. Lawrence's class was wrong, but running away from it won't solve anything. Amira looked at him, confused. What do you mean? You've shown incredible strength today, he continued, but strength isn't just about walking away from a problem. It's about facing it head on, owning your actions, and taking responsibility for them. Amira's heart sank. Was he saying she had made a mistake? I'm not saying you were wrong to stand up for yourself, Mr. Henderson clarified quickly. You were right to speak out. But there's a bigger picture here, Amira. You've been wronged, yes. And it's not just Mrs. Lawrence who needs to be held accountable. The school as a whole needs to understand that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable. But you also have a choice now. A choice to either let this define you or to take control of your future and make sure it's something you can be proud of. Amira felt a mixture of confusion and clarity. She had thought that leaving school, leaving everything behind, would be the end of it. But now, looking at Mr. Henderson, she realized that the real battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Do you want to make this right? Mr. Henderson asked, his eyes steady on hers. Amira nodded slowly. Yes, she whispered, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. I want to make this right. And with that, Amira made her choice. She would stay, but not to remain a silent victim. She would stay to fight for herself, for every student who had ever felt unheard or unseen. She would stay to ensure that Mrs. Lawrence's words, her cruelty, and her judgment would not define her. The battle for justice had only just begun. The days following Amira's dramatic exit from Mrs. Lawrence's classroom were filled with uncertainty, but also a quiet sense of anticipation. She had made her stand, but now the real work began. The entire school buzzed with whispers, and it wasn't long before the news of what had happened in the classroom reached the principal's office. For days, there was tension in the air. Amira's bold decision had shaken the foundation of the school, challenging the status quo and forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. Amira's resolve was tested in the days that followed. She hadn't expected the entire school to be on her side, but the sheer scale of support she received from some unexpected corners of the student body gave her strength. The students who had always been quiet, who had often been overlooked or dismissed, began to approach her. They shared their own stories of mistreatment, of bullying, of feeling unheard. It was as though Amira's stand had opened a door that no one had dared to open before. They weren't just her peers, they were her allies. Together they formed an unspoken bond, a network of people who, despite their differences, were united by a common cause, to be seen and heard. But the road was not easy. Mrs. Lawrence, humiliated by the events of the past week, had become even more vindictive. She would throw barbed comments Amira's way whenever they crossed paths. The other teachers, who had long been silent observers of Mrs. Lawrence's behavior, seemed hesitant to get involved. They were either too afraid of rocking the boat or too indifferent to care. The principal, Mr. Reynolds, had called Amira into his office the day after the incident. He listened carefully to her account, nodded thoughtfully, and then assured her that the school would look into the matter. But despite his promise, Amira knew that the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and nothing would be resolved overnight. Still, she was determined. She had started this fight, and she wouldn't back down. Her mother, seeing the change in her daughter, was a mix of pride and concern. She worried about the emotional toll this would take on Amira, but she also saw something new in her eyes, something fierce and unyielding. Amira was no longer the quiet girl who accepted things as they were. She was finding her voice, and it was a powerful thing to witness. One afternoon, as Amira sat in the school library, a familiar voice called out to her, "Amira!" It was Mr. Henderson. He had been a quiet, guiding presence throughout the turmoil, offering advice and encouraging Amira to stay the course. His gentle but firm words had been a steady anchor for her in moments of doubt. "Have you thought about speaking at the school assembly next week?" Mr. Henderson asked. His tone was casual, but there was a seriousness behind his question. Amira blinked, surprised. "Speak at the assembly? But why me?" He smiled, a small but knowing smile. "You've already proven you have something important to say. This school needs to hear your story. You've taken a step that no one else has had the courage to take. Now you can show them the power of standing up for what's right." At first, Amira hesitated. The idea of speaking in front of the entire school terrified her. But as she thought about it, she realized that this was her chance to turn her pain into something meaningful. She could use her voice to spark change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced. The days leading up to the assembly were filled with preparation. Amira spent hours practicing her speech, drafting and redrafting it, making sure it captured the truth of her experience without sounding bitter or vengeful. She wanted to be heard, but more importantly, she wanted to be understood. It was a delicate balance, but she knew she had to get it right. Her words could make or break this moment. The day of the assembly arrived. The gymnasium was packed, the hum of conversation echoing off the walls as students and teachers took their seats. Amira stood backstage, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. She had spoken in front of a classroom before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about getting an answer right on a test or impressing a teacher. It was about speaking her truth, about letting everyone see her for who she truly was. When the time came, Mr. Henderson gave her a reassuring smile before leading her to the microphone. The gym fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. Amira took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press against her chest. But instead of faltering, she stood tall, her shoulders back, her hands steady. "I'm not here today because I want sympathy," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because I want to be heard. We all want to be heard. Every single one of us, whether we're rich or poor, whether we fit in or not, deserves to have our voices recognized." She paused, letting her words sink in, before continuing. "I've spent my entire life trying to prove that I am worth something, that I am more than the label society tries to put on me. And I know I'm not the only one here who feels that way. I know there are others who have been dismissed, overlooked, and ignored." The room was silent, every ear trained on her. "I've learned a lot over the past few weeks," she said. "But the most important thing I've learned is that no one has the right to make us feel small. No one has the right to tell us we don't belong. We are all worthy of respect, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity." Amira's heart pounded as she looked out at the sea of faces in front of her. Some students were nodding, others looked deep in thought, and some were even wiping away tears. She knew that her words were hitting home. "I'm not perfect," Amira continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't have all the answers, and I've made mistakes. But I refuse to let anyone define my worth based on what they see on the outside. I refuse to let anyone tell me what I can and can't do. I am more than my circumstances." With one final heartfelt message, she concluded, "We all have a choice. We can choose to stay silent, or we can choose to speak up. We can choose to accept things as they are, or we can choose to fight for what's right. The choice is ours." The room remained silent for a moment after she finished speaking, and then slowly applause began to ripple through the gym. Well, at first it was hesitant, almost unsure, but then it grew louder, more confident, until the entire room was clapping for her, not out of pity, but out of respect. Respect for her courage, respect for her strength, respect for her voice. After the assembly, things began to change. Mrs. Lawrence, for all her resistance, was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. The school initiated an investigation into her behavior, and while it didn't result in an immediate termination, it led to mandatory sensitivity training and a reevaluation of how teachers interacted with students. The administration was forced to acknowledge that something needed to change in the way they handled issues of bullying, favoritism, and discrimination. But the true victory wasn't just in what happened to Mrs. Lawrence, it was in what happened to Amira. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked girl who hid behind her grades. She was a leader, someone who had found her voice and was using it to create change. Her story spread beyond the walls of her school, inspiring others to stand up for themselves, to be unapologetic about their worth, and to never let anyone dim their light. As Amira looked back on everything that had happened, she realized something profound. Her battle wasn't just about confronting Mrs. Lawrence, it was about confronting herself. It was about recognizing her own worth and refusing to let anyone or anything take that away from her. In the end, Amira's journey wasn't just about standing up to a teacher. It was about reclaiming her power, her dignity, and her future. It was a lesson in resilience, in the strength that lies in speaking your truth, and in the belief that no one can define you but yourself. And as she walked down the halls of her school, she no longer felt like the poor girl who didn't belong. She felt like someone who had the power to change the world. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this emotional story, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story. Don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts about the story.